Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. Remember, please, that Charlie Fabian is available to take your suggestions, ideas, proposals, complaints about the show. That makes it easier for us to do a better job. You can reach him at charlie.info438@gmail.com. charlie.info438@gmail.com. And again, our newly released book, Understanding Capitalism, available at our website, democracyatwork.info, is a really good companion reading for what this this program delivers. We use the materials gathered in that book to organize and structure the segments of analysis we do on this show. And vice versa, what's in that book is the distilled understanding of the capitalist system that, working all these years on all these programs, has enabled us to put together. So if you like the program, I think you'll like the book. Okay. Today's subject matter is called The Persistence of Socialism. And you'll see what we mean by that as we go through it. But we'll have three segments, one of them about a recent event, and the other two more theoretical in one case and more historical in the other. But the idea behind it all is the persistence of socialism. So let's begin. The Spanish government recently passed some laws that included fines imposed on airline companies. And I thought you would all be interested not just in the specifics, which got very little coverage, even though I know you'll be interested, but also what it means, where it leads you in your mind as you think about it. Here's what these laws expressly forbid the airline company from doing. Apparently, these airline companies, or some of them in Spain, not all, were charging customers to print a boarding pass. If you didn't want to use your cell phone, you didn't have that technical capability, and you wanted to have it in your hand, or maybe for a record, they would charge you $10-20 or the equivalent to print a boarding pass. Here's another one they forbid: to charge you for carrying on your own luggage. In other words, not for checking your bag in the old way that you used to do, where you would pick it up after the plane landed from the place where the suitcases come down. No. This is if you have a briefcase or a laptop or something that you are holding, you are carrying, and you're going to put, below your seat, if Lord knows there's room. They charge you for that, and a lot. This put the Spanish government in direct conflict with the airline companies. They fought like crazy against these laws, and they lost that struggle because the customers complained. The people who ride the airplanes were outraged by these fees. It was particularly being used by what are called low-cost carriers, who sell you a ticket at a low price and then hit you with all these extras that make it no longer a low price at all, which means the whole low price game is an advertising hustle and dishonest at its core. Well, that means the issue of pricing is brought to the fore. And why am I talking about that? Because it confronts you with who has the power over your life and who doesn't. What good is the wage you get, which after all is what? The amount of money you have in your hand at the end of a week in which you have worked and now you receive your paycheck. Now, that means you have X dollars or X pesetas or whatever the currency is, and now you can spend it. Yeah, but the employer has gotten you now at both ends. The employer has power over how much he pays you. You all know that. But it turns out the same employer, or employers in general, control what you have to pay to get something with the wage you've earned. And they can get you at the one place by giving you low wages, or they can get you at the other place by charging a lot for the milk and the eggs and the rent and so forth. Or if you're really unlucky as a worker, you get whacked at both ends. And who's doing the whacking? The employer. So what we see here in Spain is people reacting and saying, wait a minute, there's got to be some limit to how we get whacked. If you're going to pay us what you pay us, then we're not going to tolerate being charged $20 to print something or to carry our own hand luggage on the airplane. It's just too much. All I'm asking you to think about is, why stop at this little detail? Why are we having controls on just these two items? Why not on the price of the airline travel itself? Why not price controls on everything? At least limits as to what the employer can do. You know, after many years of struggle, we developed limits on how low a wage can go. That's called a minimum wage law. But why don't we have a maximum price law to go with it? That way we would control, at least within a range, how low the employer can push the wage or how high the employers as a group can jack up the prices. It's the logic of how the 97% of us that are not employers would be getting a better deal out of the economy than we now get. The employer has all the cards in this game. How much to pay us, and then how much to charge us when we spend what they paid us. Are we mice or are we human beings? Are we just takers or do we have some control? And yeah, we can get the government here or there like they did in Spain in my example. But it points to a much larger problem which needs a much larger governmental apparatus. A way for workers' needs, workers' interests, both as wage recipients and as consuming spenders, to have their interests protected. That's what the Spanish story teaches us. My second update has to do with a comment I see in the mainstream media far too often, and one that makes me upset when it goes unchallenged. The remark is more or less in these words: socialism has never worked. It's some bloviating politician or business leader who breezily avoids the hard question of understanding what socialism is and how it has worked, which often these folks don't even know, let alone capable of presenting it in a coherent way. But that's not the point. They want to get it off the table. They can't, in fact, refute it, which is why they dismiss it. It's a ploy. It's a hustle. It's a debating trick. Don't be fooled. So let me do it with you. Let's deal with that phrase. Socialism has never worked. Well, of course, this depends on what you mean by socialism. We don't agree. The world is full of material about socialism, and one of the few things it's clear about is that we do not agree. People in Scandinavia, for example, use the word socialism in a way that is different from how they used it in the Soviet Union, or how they use it today in North Korea or Cuba. China refers to itself as socialism with Chinese characteristics because they distinguish that from socialism with other characteristics. So, what you mean by socialism has never worked depends on what you mean by socialism. But it also depends on what you mean by worked. What does that mean, worked? I'm going to give you examples now that show you that the phrase socialism has never worked is nonsense and doesn't belong in any intelligent, educated person's vocabulary. Here we go. Some people call socialism anything economic that is done by the government, any economic product made by the government or service operated by the government, where the government hires people who perform, who use their brains and muscles to provide a service or a good. Okay, if that's what you mean by socialism, and millions of people use it that way every day, then here are some examples in the United States of socialism. The post office, Amtrak, most schools in the country, fire departments, police, and the army. I don't think most Americans would consider that none of those work. Of course, they work. Schools educate, fire departments extinguish blazes, etc., etc. These are government economic activities. The government pays a worker a wage to perform them. If that's what you mean by socialism, it works, and Americans have paid for their schools, their fire departments, their police departments, their Amtrak tickets, and their stamps for the mail because they believe these things worked. Wow. Think again about socialism doesn't work. Then there's the Soviet Union. They had another meaning for socialism. That's when the government owns and operates all of industry, not just Amtrak, but everything. Everything. Maybe excepting the farms, agriculture, but all industry. Now, did it work in the Soviet Union? Again, if you mean, were they able to run a society for 70 years, from 1917, when they made their revolution, to 1990, when they fell apart? The answer is they worked real well from that time. How do I know that they worked real well? Well, they went from the poorest country in Europe to the number one challenger of the dominance of the United States. No one expected that in 1917 when they made their revolution. So if you want to look at their history, well, then socialism worked. Now, it worked better in some areas than others. For example, in the realm of military production, armaments, the Soviet Union worked really well. They defeated Hitler. That was quite an achievement for a country that was much less developed than Germany. And many of the weapons now being used by the Russians after the Soviet Union is gone in Ukraine are proving to be as good or better than anybody else's weapons. In that area, military-industrial complex, socialism worked. Well, we've come to the end of the first half of today's program. What I'm going to do in the second half is finish this analysis of how, when, where, why socialism works, and then go on to answer the question, when capitalism fell apart in the Great Depression of the 1930s, the American working class went sharply to the left politically. Now that U.S. capitalism is entering another period of crisis with the decline of its empire and the building up of internal tensions and contradictions, it looks like the working class is moving to the right. So at least the Trump election would suggest. And I'm going to answer the question, why did that happen? Stay with me. We'll be right back. Friends, as you know, any project like this takes money, and we don't want to bore you or burden you. On the other hand, you, our audience, are the source of our funding, and we wouldn't have it any other way. If you can, please consider making a donation. It will be enormously appreciated. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. In the first half, we were closing in on the topic, does socialism work? Or maybe I should be clearer, refuting the claim that socialism has never worked. And the point I was making was that socialisms are different, and depending on what we mean, the sentence has any content or not. And likewise, what does work mean? If work meant in the Soviet Union, going from the poorest country in Europe to the great challenger of the number one capitalist economy, the US, then socialism worked for them. Of course, if you mean worked is the extent of civil liberties, then you might reach the conclusion that in that area it didn't. But then that's true of every system, that there are areas where they work and areas where they don't. Certainly true of the United States. Do you think capitalism works when you know we have more people in jail as a percentage of our population than any other country? Is that working? That we are more violent, that we carry more guns, that we commit crimes of personal violence on a scale other societies that. My point is not to say that we have troubles, which I assume you all know. It's that assessing our system, capitalism, has its strengths and weaknesses, and the same is true of any of the countries that have called themselves socialist. An honest appraisal would look at all of that. A dishonest one would dismiss it by saying it never worked. Let me come to China, because in one way it's the most dramatic example. They don't agree with the Soviet Union. They don't make all of their industry owned and operated by the government. And they don't agree with the United States and Britain, for example, in which the overwhelming bulk of industry is privately owned and operated. China is different from both because they are a hybrid. They're about 50-50. Half the industries are owned and operated by the government, the other half by private capitalists, both Chinese and foreign, because they have allowed and indeed welcomed foreign capitalists, including many Americans, to do business there. And what have they achieved? Their socialism, as they define it, their 50-50 government-private. Well, they've achieved the fastest economic growth in the recorded history of the human race. In 30 years, they have gone from the poorest imaginable society, after 100 years, they call it, of humiliation about being a third world economy. And they've become the great competitor of the United States today, matching the technological achievements of the United States, the Apples, the Microsoft, you name it, with their own Chinese equivalents that do as well and often better. They're the ones who've produced the best quality, lowest price electric cars and trucks in the world. Are those signs of success? Of course they are. If you mean by success the economic growth they've achieved, annual increases in GDP of 6 to 9% for most of the last 30 years. This year alone, Chinese economic growth, according to the IMF, 4.8%, compared to the United States, 2.8%. There is no question. Who's succeeding more? If your measure of success, if what you mean by it works is economic growth, which a large number of economists, left, right, and center, accept as a perfectly good measure of how well an economic system works. That doesn't mean that China doesn't have enormous problems. It does. Almost all societies do. Because if you look at a society, you see areas where it is successful and areas where it isn't, which is a rational, reasonable thing for human beings to do. The phrase socialism has never worked is ignorant and senseless all at once. It tells you much more about the person who says such things than it tells you about socialism. But we're not done. There are socialists who don't think that it's all about what the state does. Is the state running the industry or not, part of it or all of it? There are people for whom socialism is something different. These are the people who think that socialism is when you don't run your enterprises, your factories, your offices, your schools, from a top-down, undemocratic way, with a group of bosses at the top who tell an army of employees what to do. No, they believe that socialism means a democratic workplace. Everybody, one person, one vote. You decide democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product. For them, that's socialism. Does that exist? Yes. Has it existed for a long time? Yes. Do we have a history of how it works? Yes. What is it called? Worker co-op. They're all over the place in the United States and even more in Europe and even more in other parts of the world. We have a history. We know. Have they survived? Yes, they have. Have they done well? Many have. All of them? No. They have, guess what? Their strengths and weaknesses, which a rational person would look at. But do you want examples? I'll give you one. It's called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, one of the biggest examples of worker co-ops in the world. It exists in Spain and in some other countries. It started in 1956 with a Catholic priest and 6 workers. It's now the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It has 150,000 workers, more or less. It is a growth story, a success story. Does socialism in terms of worker co-ops work? You betcha. And there's 150,000 families in Spain who will tell you how it has transformed their lives. Does that mean every worker co-op is a success? Of course not. But again, the dismissal, socialism has never worked, nonsense. You're being talked to by a person who doesn't know and who probably doesn't care. And you ought to wonder to yourself, why am I talking to such a person? Okay. The last economic update for today is about history. And it wants to answer this question. Capitalism is going through a rough time right now. Bad inflation, 2 really bad crashes, 2008 and 2020. A working class that's hurting by all accounts. But it's going to the right politically. Is there something intrinsic about that? Is that always what happens? No. But I'm going to show that to you by giving you the example of the last time American capitalism went through a horrific crisis. It's the 1930s. The economy crashes in October of 1929 and doesn't climb out of the economic crisis for 11 years when the war, because that's all that solved our problem then. We couldn't find a way to put the millions of people that were unemployed back to work. Some of them, but not most of them. The war did that. We took the unemployed, put half of them in a uniform and the other half in a factory making the uniform, the guns, the planes, and all the rest. But here's the question. In the 1930s, the American working class, stung by the collapse of capitalism, went to the left politically. Whereas now, the working class, stung by capitalism's crisis, has gone to the right politically. Significant number of working people voted for Donald Trump twice. Okay, what's going on? Why? That's what I'm going to answer in 5 minutes. When workers lost their jobs in 1929, 30, 31, 32, relentlessly, up until 1933 when the unemployment rate was 25%, 6 times what it is now. 1 out of 4 workers out of work. Every American family with at least one unemployed member, often multiples. At a time when those who still had a job were earning very little, they had to take care of at least one person who didn't earn anything at all. And that was before unemployment compensation. So when you lost your job, you had nothing, or you stood on line at the soup kitchen maintained by the local church. What did workers do? They decided to fight back. They didn't vote for right-wing billionaires. Of course not. They joined unions on a scale America has never seen. Never before that, never since. Millions of people who had never been in a union joined a union. Why? To save their situation. Who led the unions in mobilizing tens of millions of workers? 2 socialist and 1 communist party. Strong parties at that time, nationwide in their scope. Hundreds of thousands of Americans joined those political parties and worked with them and with the unions to develop the CIO, the most powerful union movement this country has ever seen. What did they get out of the government? They demanded radical left-wing reforms. They demanded a social security system, and they got it. If you are 65 years of age or older and have given a lifetime of work, you're going to get a pension check from Social Security every month for as long as you live. Wow, we never had that. They developed unemployment compensation. If you lose a job through no fault of your own, the government will give you a check once a week for a year to help you get through it and find another job. They passed the first minimum wage, and they hired 15 million American unemployed people to work for the government, to get a job, to get income, to thereby maintain their mortgage payments and hold on to their house. Unheard of left-wing objectives put forward by socialists, and they got it all. But here comes what's perhaps the best part. How did a government in the depths of a depression, when it had no money, millions of people out of work, don't pay taxes, companies going belly up, don't pay taxes, how did the government do that? Answer, it taxed corporations and the rich. Wow. That's how the rich and the corporations were taxed to make life better for the mass of working people. And the president who presided over all of that, FDR, was reelected 3 times, by far the most popular president in the United States from George Washington to the president right now, or coming in. No one should think the American working class's direction of political commitment is necessarily to the right or necessarily stuck with the Democratic Party middle. It was left-wing the last time. It can be so again. And nothing makes that more likely than the probable failure of Mr. Trump to do anything to save the capitalism more this time than he was able to do the last time, namely next to nothing. I hope you found this historical story worth thinking about. And as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.